Hello, everybody, and welcome to a special bonus episode of the Ask Historians podcast, episode 87A. As you can probably tell from the episode title, today is a little extra of our podcast released on Friday. In this podcast extra, there will be a bit of friendly debate and conversation, more so than usual between host and interviewee, over the nature of postmodernism, whether it's a good or a bad thing, and how it affects history, and even where we go from here. This episode is only lightly edited, so there will be a lot more ums and ahs and pauses than you're used to. So I hope this provides a behind-the-scenes look at both the podcast and how historians today are thinking and struggling with facing the modern world. Sit back and enjoy this special bonus episode.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
I don't think that's an unreasonable conclusion, but I don't think that's essentially postmodernism, because one of the theories, and this is me speaking from my own personal perspective, one of the theories that undergirds postmodernism is the idea that everything is relative. And that obviously is out of Albert Einstein, is one of the main precursors of postmodernism, both as a literary movement and as a history movement. So the idea that everything is relative, that there is no necessary past, that there is no necessary fact, that there is only alternative facts or certain ideas, is something that comes out of postmodernism, where you have a world drained of meaning, where history doesn't necessarily mean anything.
So I think that's that's definitely the worst version of postmodernism. It's not an unfair version, though. It's definitely not an unfair version. I think that there is a variety of postmodernism that has embraced that in a kind of completely reductive way, so that kind of whatever is just acceptable. I think what has to prevent that slide is the thing that I've been talking about throughout, which is that at base, if you're doing history, you have to have sources and you have to have evidence. And I think if you stick to that you can both appreciate the relativity of experience and of the genuine and really considerable differences that emerge, and still sort of keep your feet on the ground. Now, that's not to say that a lot of people don't keep their feet on the ground. And that's, I think, the part that has taken on a kind of broader sort of social thing right now. So we're dancing around it, right? But there's lots of concern about exactly this sort of thing in the world right now. And so part of it is that postmodern thought, the best parts of postmodern thought are, I think, almost uncontroversial at this point. I think a lot of people accept the first thing that I said as kind of not even postmodernism, because it's so banal, but it's actually, I think, pretty core to the idea. I think it is the core of the idea. But the people who are really, really insistent on calling themselves postmodernists and who have some stake in that term in a way that I don't, I would put it in that toolbox that I've been talking about the whole time. I would put it in a group with all of the other things that we've talked about as a way of understanding the past. There is a desire to make it keep standing out, and a way of emphasizing some of the aspects of that way of seeing the world that are, in my opinion, less explanatory and less useful, but are nonetheless seductive and not entirely wrong-headed, but also I think can fall down the slippery slope that you kind of described.
So part of the thing you say is that history is sources. In order to do history, you need sources, and that's an absolutely valid point, and that I think is one of the reasons that history continues to fascinate and attract me, because I think history is more than postmodernism. Because part of the reason postmodernism started in a sense was that you let's go back to our example of a factory worker. You just talk about the factory workers going to work, clocking out, and going home. But postmodernism comes back to that and says, well, wait, let's think about the woman that undergirded that ability for them to go home and have food. But wait, let's think of the slave labor that enabled Victorian England to rule an empire that large. So postmodernism takes that, I guess the worst form of postmodernism takes that to that logical extreme of saying there is no right or wrong. It kind of goes to almost a nihilist perspective of saying there is no necessarily truth. There's only the signs and the signifiers.
Right. And I think you could actually give an even more damning version of it than you just did, because I think you can actually ground that first part back in the materialist if you want to, right? With slave labor and domestic labor, and expanding the kind of sphere of consciousness around that materialist version of history in a way that is not postmodernist, but I think a postmodernist would, the version of postmodernism that you're most concerned about would go way farther and say, you know, the way there's nothing really that we can even say about, say, the difference between a woman living in 20th century United States versus like the way someone is living in, I don't know, pick an arbitrary time and place. So
15th century England.
Sure. It's not that there is no difference, it's that there's really nothing to say about it, right? There's no, you can just kind of describe the differences and examine the differences. And I think that that's true in a some sense, right? There's an underlying kernel here that is still valuable, which is that if what I'm really interested in is understanding 15th century English women, then there is something to be said for trying to take it entirely on its own terms, that experience. But when that version of thinking is sort of not in any way bounded, then, you know, then you can, you know, lose any kind of explanatory power or lose any kind of version of a coherent past.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense.
It does.
So I think that's why, you know, postmodernism is valuable, is that it does remind us in its best moments that if we want to understand those historical figures in their historical moment, that doing our best to see their version of the world is an important task. I think that is an important task, but I don't think that kind of going and taking that starting point and saying that, you know, we can't say anything about anything makes much sense to me at all. I can kind of see how you can get there, but it's never really felt compelling to me.
To me, I guess the epitome of postmodern history would be the Fukuyama essay saying the end of history is nigh. No longer existent, apparent, necessary. And to me, I think that's almost like a degradation of what history should and can be, because I think history is, I think I generally quote from, I think it's Carl Becker here, when he said, "We are that ancient and honorable company of wise men of the tribe, of bards and storytellers and minstrels, of soothsayers and priests, that voice around the fire that measures humanity as a whole from what we say we are versus what we actually have been or actually are." Historians are the sacred storytellers, or the sacred carriers of the truth into the future. And I think that idea is completely at odds with postmodernism, because postmodernism said there is no necessary truth, there is no necessary voice around the fireplace. And even to argue that there is a voice around the fireplace is to say that it is to propose a certain sort of vision or a certain sort of idea that doesn't exist and shouldn't exist anymore.
So there's a few things to unpack there. So to take Fukuyama as an example, so I think that's we've maybe been a little slapdash in our treatment of materialism versus not materialism. I think we're verging on different non-materialist understandings of history kind of all being one thing, because we can call them not materialist, or maybe because we've just not had enough time to really delve into all of them. Whatever the reason, Fukuyama was very concerned with the struggle between the Soviet Union, obviously, and the United States. And he saw that as primarily a struggle between capitalism and the struggle between communism. And by the way, I think Fukuyama's end of history thesis doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I don't think you could have an end of history, as you were kind of just describing. But it was not necessarily, in my estimation, totally relativist and postmodernist. But it was not materialist. It was certainly a way of seeing the world that put above all else an ideological struggle, and that is something that is not totally wrongheaded, right? We could look at history as a struggle of ideology, but I think this is again one of the dangers of using theory as a sort of one-stop shop instead of as a toolbox. And I think it would have been much clearer that if we looked at the world after the fall of the Soviet Union, not through the lens of simply ideology, but through a variety of lenses, that we would see that there were still plenty of engines humming along. But to answer the bigger point, the bigger question about postmodernism kind of taking away our ability to have that conversation between past and present, right? We talked at the outset about E.H. Carr's sort of idea that history is a conversation between past and present. It does seem that postmodernism could, in some sense, cut the legs out from under that conversation, and that seems to be your concern. And I think that practically that's a valid concern. I think there is some reason to worry about that, but I don't think that means throwing out that tool from the toolbox, if that makes sense.
Yeah, of course not. I would absolutely agree with you. It makes no sense to throw postmodernism out of the toolbox, but to me, postmodernism is both the reason and the cause for us being in the place where the humanities is drastically underfunded, where we do a poor job of justifying our existence in the larger culture. And I think that's because we kind of got lost in this wallowing pool of postmodernism in the 80s, never really or haven't yet really gotten out of it. And I think we need to move past and beyond it to a different form of thinking, a different form of being as historians and justifying our existence to the public and being public intellectuals. And I don't think dwelling in postmodernism, I don't think dwelling in postmodern ideas is really the way of doing it. I guess I will belie the fact that I strongly detest postmodernism, and I think that almost as like an alternative fact, the whole thing can't even be entertained. It's just, okay, that happened. Let's move on. Let's continue to focus on how we can teach the story of history, how we can teach the story of humanity to the public.
I'm still here. I'm thinking. Okay, so I think that there's a number of points here that are important. First, that as a professional responsibility, there's definitely no doubt that historians need to do a better job of explaining why what they're saying matters, and also doing a better job explaining their history in language that is accessible. As in any profession, there's a lot of jargon, and we've probably bordered onto it or outright gone into it. I know I have in this conversation, probably unthinkingly most of the time, because it's the language in which I'm trained. But that can be sidestepped with careful explanation and clear, concise language. That's something that I try to do when I post on Ask Historians, to bring us back to that, as a way of engaging with some of these ideas in a way that is as accessible as possible, because they are complicated. I mean, the issues that we've been talking about for the last little while are genuinely complicated, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they need to be discussed in a kind of coded, jargony language of specialists. And that's something that postmodernists, I think, probably are accused of rightly doing in too many cases, which is using a very particular language that, if you are not used to reading, is kind of inscrutable and kind of sounds like nonsense and doesn't really say much. And so I think that's part of the reason that there's a hostility there, rightly so in that case. That, again, many of these ideas, the best ideas that come out of this tradition, this postmodern tradition, I think are practically uncontroversial and in use, like, on a day-to-day basis by a lot of people, but that some of the things that you've been talking about are not only less accessible because of the fact that they're built on a tradition that isn't well understood, but are also not. There's very little attempt made by the same people putting forth those arguments to make their arguments accessible to a general audience. You really have to go out of your way to figure out what they're saying.
Mm-hmm. So to me, that represents the central dilemma of history, or I guess academic history in this era, is how do we move beyond these abstract and obtuse and very obscure arguments that we kind of got stuck in, I would say, in the 1980s, 1990s.
Yeah, I think that's the right timeline.
And how do we move beyond that? I mean, the end of history, the Fukuyama example, he essentially says, well, the Soviet Union has collapsed, liberal democracy and free market capitalism has seceded. We have reached the end of history. The only thing that's here from now on is the increasing spread of freedom and democracy and capitalism, because those are the best things, clearly. And obviously, Fukuyama is I guess, a piss poor historian, but like you kind of see Fukuyama in current political rhetoric. You see him, or that idea of postmodernism is, well, it doesn't matter. My perspective is what matters. This is the current reality. We're going to go with this reality. We've always been at war with East Asia. That, to me, threatens the very purpose of history, threatens the very idea of history, threatens the very reality that we surround ourselves with every day. And if we indulge in that, we're undermining our own authority. We're undermining our own perspective, where we're essentially saying, oh, well, everybody to everybody their own history.
Right. So again, a number of things to talk about there, and I agree with most of it, in principle, at least. So the sort of class of civilizations that you're talking about, I guess Fukuyama said in the end of history that it was over, but we have like Sam Huntington saying, no, this is actually like this is going to be what drives the 21st century. So scholars have entertained this idea. Second of all, although that kind of relativism, that sort of extreme relativism, where like we can't say the people doing this thing are doing a bad thing, like it's just what they do. I think that's the kind of thinking that you're concerned about. It's the kind of thinking that a lot of people are concerned about. So I'm in practice that is deployed in really arbitrary ways. The people who I think would be accused of that kind of language would be really happy to hear that this week, the week that we're taping this, the people who gang raped a woman on a bus in India 3 or 4 years ago was convicted. They were all convicted. So that's a complication in our discussion, in that the practice of deploying this kind of language is not ideologically consistent. In a way that's probably, it's good that it's not ideologically consistent. But nonetheless, I don't think we can describe it in purely ideological ways, because the way it's deployed in practice is not just an actual nihilist, nothing matters kind of way. I mean, you can find people like that, but I don't think that we are actually close to that. On the other hand, I take your point about hashtag fake news and the like. Right, there is a real problem with the ability to discern what's real at the moment, what the truth is at the moment. And I don't think that's 100% to do with postmodernism. Maybe it's to do with postmodernity, which is related, but not ideological. It's more of a descriptive state of where we are. The issue there being that, particularly in what I'll call the information moment, not necessarily the information age, but I'm talking like really about like the last 5 years, where maybe 10 years max, where just information is just, it's unbounded, basically free, absolutely everywhere, and universally accessible. You know, let's use that as our kind of description of the moment. We're in a position where information is cheap and everywhere and free, and the ability to engage meaningfully with that information, regardless of one's ideological perspective or leanings, is much less ubiquitous, much more rare, and certainly much more expensive, right? It's not easy to get to the point where you can do that well. It takes a lot of time and effort. And that's a real concern. That's a real concern. And I don't think that's necessarily just a fact of our ideological framework or of our worldview or of our perspective, but that's a problem with the current ubiquity of information that we have as a species not resolved.
And it's something we have yet to grapple with, and to me, historians and I guess literary theorists like English PhDs and English majors haven't figured out how to grapple with it, and instead we're stuck in arguing old arguments or fighting old battles that were relevant in the 1980s, no longer relevant. And to me, and I guess I definitely know I cast my umbrella too large in ascribing all of this to postmodernism. It's an example of, as you say, postmodernity, which I guess it'd be difficult to define, and I'm going to define it for the purposes of this this bonus episode. But it's going to be difficult to move forward, and I guess I am impatient to move forward, and I don't think I am necessarily smart or intelligent enough to say this is our new movement, this is where we're going to go from here. But I lose patience with arguing these old battles over what is true and what is relevant. And I think we need to, as an academy, move forward and confront the very real realities that we're facing now. We need to be public intellectuals. And to me, part of that is moving beyond postmodernism. And I think you've seen, I made the point earlier that I don't think we've, as history majors, we never really had a romantic period. We never really had a postmodern period of writing. And increasingly, I think you are seeing historians experimenting with postmodern styles of writing. An example would be focusing on one topic, like I guess one of the historians that crossed both popular and academic divide would be the historian who writes about, the titles of his books are Cod and Salt. And I actually cannot remember his name right now, but he focuses on salt throughout history as a topic, but he skips around, he ignores conventional time boundaries. And I think that's a great way of doing postmodern history. But I think we need to move even beyond that and defend. I think historians are really the last people defending truth. And we need to do our job. We need to define our purpose and defend our purpose. Otherwise, what are we doing?
So I agree with most of that. I want to give more credit to our other fields who are doing an admirable job also defending the truth. Although I think historians have a particularly useful training in this particular moment, where one of the things that we do is have this discussion, right? We're having this discussion. I think the fact that we're having it shouldn't be lost here. By which I mean navigating the sort of treacherous waters between what might be called the past, sort of the facts of what happened in the past, and the experience of those things that happened. That's something that historians are at least pretty good at doing. We've been working on that for a long time, and that's a skill that is particularly important right now. But we are not, I don't think, the only profession left that's concerned with that. Again, at the outset here, I defended sort of a broad version of rational thinking that I think historians engage in, that scientists engage in, that anyone who's doing kind of intellectually honest work has to be engaging in. And there are many people in a variety of fields that are doing that. Otherwise, as you say, what are we doing at all? So I completely agree that anyone who is devoted to that particular project, regardless of the field in which they are trained or in which they find themselves, is someone that I consider an ally going forward.
What you're saying is scientists defending global warming in a political environment that denies global warming even exists.
Right. And I mean, that's one that is both topical and kind of particular, in that the number of people who deny global warming or climate change is pretty huge in the United States, but it's also like an incredibly mainstream, the acceptance of climate change as a serious problem is actually really mainstream in a lot of places. It's only really controversial in its particular way that it's controversial in the United States. But that is one that that scientists are doing obviously the right kind of work in insisting that that's a real problem, and it's probably our most important problem.
So do we want to cut it off right there, and kind of leave people with the opportunity to go forth and discover for themselves?
I'm okay with that. I feel like we could chat for a long time. I'd be happy.
We should probably return to this conversation later.
But yeah, it's been a couple hours.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/askhistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.